I'm Matthew Quirk, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Matthew Quirk.
a revolutionary quantum teleportation device promises to bring humanity one step closer to the stars until it fails spectacularly. The Translocator from M.G. Herron, available now on audible.com. Go to mgherron.com/ASP. Archaeologist Eliana Fisk is ripped from Earth while the whole world watches. She lands on a strange new world inhabited by a lost tribe of ancient Mayans. Meeting them, getting first-hand exposure to age-old customs and rituals. It seems like an archaeologist's dream. But what if the rituals have a darker meaning? What if the God these people pray to is no God at all? And how in the world will she ever get back home? Thus begins a pulse-pounding race against time that hurls Eliana into a great unknown, revealing ancient technologies and marvelous mysteries more outlandish than she ever imagined. The Translocator is an action-packed sci-fi thriller perfect for fans of Stargate, the Atlantis Gene, and other archaeology-inspired science fiction adventures. Pick it up today. Go to mgherron.com/ASP. That's mgherron.com/ASP. The Translocator by M.G. Herron. Welcome to Author Stories. Find archives of all the shows at hankgarner.com, and while you're there, never miss an episode by subscribing to the show on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, and YouTube. It's free on all platforms. Out today, Book 3 of the Saga of the Iron Dragon, the conclusion of the epic series that began with the dream of the Iron Dragon. 9th century Iceland, 3 explorers from the far future have a daunting mission. To save humanity, they must build a craft capable of reaching the stars. The Voyage of the Iron Dragon is the concluding book in the Iron Dragon trilogy. The Iron Dragon trilogy is being produced as part of the phenomenally successful Saga of the Iron Dragon Kickstarter, which raised over $10,000. Meticulously researched and packed with action, The Dream of the Iron Dragon is a must for sci-fi and alternate history fans. Also, Book 2, The Dawn of the Iron Dragon, is available now from audible.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, thanks to Josh Hayes and Richard Fox for sponsoring the show with their series Terra Nova Chronicles. Books 1 and 2 are out now. Book 3 is coming very soon, and you can get books 1 and 2 combined on audible.com, narrated by the one and only Luke Daniels. If you're a fan of the Ember War series, this continuation is one that you are going to want to have on your Kindle, in paperback, or in audiobook. Grab it now, books 1 and 2, and be ready for book 3. Also, thanks to Rick Partlow for sponsoring the show. With his book Glory Boy, Caleb Mitchell had to give up his home to save it. Shunned by friends and family, abandoned by the love of his life, he left his world to go to the academy and train to fight in a looming war against an implacable alien threat. The fleet turned him into an enhanced super soldier designed to put the fear of God into aliens who think their emperor is God, asked to sacrifice his humanity to protect his people. But when his home world is threatened, will Caleb throw away his career and risk everything to save the people who turned their backs on him? If you're a fan of Starship Troopers or Altered Carbon, jump into the world of future super commandos and star-spanning galactic war with Glory Boy from Rick Partlow. There's links to all of our sponsors in the show notes. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am super excited to talk with Matthew Quirk. Matthew's on the show today to talk about his brand new book, The Night Agent. You guys know how big a fan of thrillers I am, and this, I know it's 2019. I know it's the beginning of 2019, but I've actually had this book for a little while, and it was very difficult for me not to name this as one of my favorite books of 2018, because for everybody else it wasn't available in 2018. But guys, if there is a book to start the year out with, this is it. The Night Agent is one of the best political thrillers I've ever read, and I think you guys are going to love it too. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Oh, thanks. And thanks for your nice words about the book. I really appreciate that.
Oh, it's an easy book to talk nice about. It's a fantastic read. But before we get into that and all the good stuff we're going to talk about, we begin each show with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, well, I mean, I have a way back memory of in, I don't know, kindergarten or first grade, where you have that yellow handwriting practice paper, and writing something that was probably 2 lines about and 2 sentences, a cat went in the woods and back, or something like that, and then stapling it together and saying, "Oh my God, I have a story," and I'm sure that's in a closet at my parents' house, still somewhere. But I think it was in college that I got the bug to write fiction really seriously, and I loved doing it so much. I would kind of do it at night, and I realized I would do anything to be able to spend all my time writing books.
I hear stories from people all the time, and there's usually an early memory like you, kindergarten, and where a story just comes alive for whatever reason to a kid, and it really ignites something in people. And I remember one of those moments for me where it was like the realization that stories could be created, and that they didn't just appear out of nowhere, but people made them. And if a person made them, then I was a person and I could make them. It's this weird thing, but when the connection's made, there's kind of no going back.
Well, I found when you really put yourself into a scene, and I used to write, I had some kind of crummy summer job in college. I think my ambitious internship plans had fallen through. It might have been after my freshman year, but it was like this kind of time travel. You could put yourself in a totally different world, and I just remembered that feeling of finally getting sucked into my own world for these books, and it was so powerful, and I liked it so much that that was the initial bug for me.
That's amazing. You said that it really kind of reignited for you in college, and that you were writing fiction just for fun. What kind of things were you reading then and maybe prior? What were the genres that just really came alive to you?
Well, I had a funny sort of longest way. What's the line? The longest way round brings you back home kind of thing, because I was addicted to Stephen King and Michael Crichton and John Grisham in like middle school. And I think it's just because I had a bedtime and I've always been a night owl. So I would be looking at 4 or 5 hours just in bed. And you could read books, so I would just stack up all the books I could, and I would read. It was my favorite thing to do in the world. And, I started near the end of high school reading more like Joseph Conrad, and then my mom went back to grad school for English, so there were tons of great books around the house, like the Odyssey, these great translations. Yeah. And then in college, it's kind of funny because there's really one style of writing that's taught in the academic setting, and that's the literary short story, especially for undergrads.
Yeah.
And so I was in these classes and I was really, blown away that they let me into these seminars with these authors. But, that was what you were supposed to write. And I tried my best, but it didn't quite click. Even though I loved writing so much, I just loved a strong plot and a story and high stakes, none of which really fit in with that domestic realist fiction,
Right.
And I think I wrote some crazy plot-driven thrillery thing that I stayed up like 2 nights in a row to hand in for a final project. And the poor author, this woman who had won the Orange Prize and was phenomenal, had to read my crazy, up all night, like ranting, trying to finish the story. And so it was this mismatch. And then what happened was I sort of fell out of the fiction habit a little bit until I went to the Atlantic and I was in DC, and I suddenly was surrounded by all this sort of foreign and intrigue, and it was the run up to the Iraq War, so there was a lot happening, and this political intrigue, and that really married sort of the interest I'd always had reading thrillers with the exciting things I was getting to poke my nose into in DC, and it all came together, and that's how I landed on political thrillers.
Well, the saying is, truth can be stranger than fiction. Is that what you started, as you kind of immersed yourself in that world? Were you realizing that the reality was not quite as far from the stories that we make up?
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways you need to make things more sensible in a book,
Right.
Because the funny thing about DC, and this people trot this line out a lot, it's more like Veep than House of Cards, because they're regular people, and you go to the White House and it's a government office at the end of the day, and it's cramped, and people are doing their best. So you need to, find the right balance between the sort of genre things, which can be a little larger than life, while also getting across the reality of the city. And that's a fun balance to strike, I think.
So, how did you wind up at the Atlantic? What did you study in college, and what was your desire for taking on journalism?
Well, journalism was one of the many things that I sort of channeled the writing impulse into, and it was really enjoyable. Although I always ran into trouble because I would want things to have more of a flourish, and they'd say, "Well, no, you should just be strictly grounded in the facts." And that was an early sign that fiction was probably a better path. So I joined the student newspaper there, which is phenomenal, and there is no undergraduate journalism. So everybody just goes to the Harvard Crimson, and it's run like a professional newspaper. And half of the people go on to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and they're incredible. And I read their stories every day. So I worked there, and I had some good features. And I was really fortunate that a woman there connected me with the new owner of the Atlantic, who had bought the magazine and was adding some staff in DC, really just to help him in sort of an office of the publisher thing, not really editorial. And he and I clicked during this interview, and he brought me down, and I slowly clawed my way from helping him with sort of the publisher research stuff into the editorial side. And that was a pretty wild experience because I studied history and literature. I had started in physics, and then I switched to the history and literature stuff. But I didn't really know anything that happened after World War II. So it was this baptism by fire in politics and foreign affairs.
I've had a number of guests who began in journalism and went on to write fiction, a lot of times crime fiction or thrillers. What do you think working in journalism gave you as a fiction writer, other than just access to, fodder for stories and things like that. But is there a particular skill, that you can point to that you feel like journalism equipped you for writing fiction?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably three things, I think. One is just the technical thing of writing quickly and clearly and succinctly. And then the other is sort of disenchanting writing a little bit. You run into this when you're kind of teaching, because even in the student newspaper, we would teach the younger kids how to do writing. And, writing, people really associate it with creativity and these romantic ideas. So you have to really tone down the flourishes and tone down some of the purple stuff. Whenever somebody writes their first feature for a newspaper or magazine, the first few paragraphs are like the most over-the-top Byron-esque or whatever.
Yeah.
There's getting over seeing your stuff in print and then, kind of getting out of the way of what the words are meant to convey. And then the third thing, and I talk about this a lot, is the ruthless, constant rejection, which was especially the case at the Atlantic, because I was a young guy, and the Atlantic gets 10,000 words a month, and you would finally claw your way into getting an article, and they'd say, "Oh, we had to kill that," and I'd say, "Well, what are you putting in its place?" And they'd say, "Salman Rushdie wanted to write something." And I'd be like, "Well, okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense."
Right.
And when it comes to book ideas and plot points, I will come up with 100 and throw out 99, and that's something that happened at the magazine a lot, and is a really valuable thing to really pick the best stuff and make sure you have a solid story before you dive in, and really make sure you have a great idea before you go for it, because you don't want to find yourself halfway through and realizing it's a bad idea.
Well, creativity in general, the creative arts, writing specifically, is one of those weird things where it kind of is magic sometimes. Story ideas come out of nowhere, characters come alive and do their own thing, in the middle of your writing, and plot lines change because, characters do things. And it's this really weird thing that sometimes it's hard to put your finger on. But then at the same time, you really have to approach it as a professional and to not hold things too precious. And to know the difference in what is a waste of time, a flight of fancy, and what is the real gold of story. Is this something that just comes with doing the work, and maybe journalism helps that, and like you said, being rejected all of the time, and learning to pare down, get to the brass tacks of what it is that you're trying to say? Is that something that just comes with time and experience? Are there any things that writers can do to kind of get out of that ethereal area and behave more professionally as a writer?
I mean, I think it does come with experience. So, in journalism, I would give 100 stories, and the editor would say that's the only good one, and I couldn't understand why often, what they had, but that was decades of experience. And he probably couldn't articulate that into some sort of flow chart. And I think books are similar in a lot of ways. And I keep around the manuscript and the crazy handwritten notes I have in it of the first book, which fortunately for everyone never saw light of day. That took me kind of 8 years of writing and rewriting. And I think that was the learning of getting a sense of scale and what works, and was so painful that I actually learned the lessons of what goes into a good story, and making sure I knew I had enough figured out to start. and so a lot of it is just judgment and experience, but I think there are shortcuts, and I think a lot of it is talking to people. So I will often talk to people and they'll have a book idea, and while they're mentioning the book idea, I think if they told it to anyone, there would just be this glaring thing.
Yes.
Why are you telling the whole story from the point of view of the person who's locked under the stairs or something? I don't know. That could be cool. But, so I don't want to mention any examples because I don't but sometimes there's just this thing, and if you mention it to other people, even as you say it out loud, you will check yourself. And similarly, if you go to tell somebody your idea for a book, and it's this, and it's this, and it's this, you have a story for 3 books.
Right.
So I've found just bringing other people in and talking and being, early on, it's really intimidating to mention these things to other people because you're sort of off in your cloud cuckoo land. So, but I found that a really great step to just talk to people and saying things out loud and getting feedback, and people will just, sort of wrinkle their nose and say, that's one too many, and things like that.
You mentioned that the first novel that you wrote that didn't get published, and I think a lot of us have those desk drawer novels or trunk novels or closet novels that thank God never see the light of day. What was that initial idea though that got you excited enough to write a novel about?
Well, that one was a cool idea. I just took so long that it was no longer timely. The idea of that thriller early on was that you can see I haven't gotten over this, so I'm still trying to defend it. Was that like Iran had sort of used some duplicitous means to trick America into going to war with Iraq. That was kind of the setup. I labored over it forever, and at the beginning, I thought it was going to be sort of an Evelyn Waugh style satire. I didn't know what kind of writer I was. But by the time I finished it, there was plenty of reporting to show that was the case, basically. I remember maybe Dexter Filkins, the New York Times Magazine. So I missed my window by about 3 or 4 years. But that's fine, because it was a good practice exercise. You don't want to live in that, that birdhouse you make in your first week of shop class.
Right. Well, I think it was Stephen King. I may be misquoting, who said when you have a great story idea and you sit down to write, when the serious drafting starts, that if you don't get that draft done in 3 or 4 months, then there's a high likelihood that the book will never be finished. And I understand what he's saying about, when everything comes together and when, striking when the iron is hot and all of that, all those cliches. But when you're writing thrillers, that kind of becomes kind of doubly important because, like you said, you had a book that it was a fantastic idea. But by the time it was finished, it was no longer plausible to be in that genre. Talk a little bit about writing in the genre and what it takes to come up with an idea that is timely, but that has a bit of shelf life. That seems like a precarious balance to me.
It is, and I wish I had the answer. And because this book, we took a long time to get it exactly right. And I was very fortunate to have a new agent and a new publisher, and they're both phenomenal. So there was, a bit of a longer road to publication with this, and it's about Russia and shenanigans in D.C. and politics, and especially now, the news tempo has become completely insane. So early on, I had a certain idea for this book, and we sort of realized that that was kind of too close to the truth, or the way a lot of these investigations and this reporting was going. So my agent and I, Dan Conaway, he's incredible. We sat down, and it was scary at the time, but it was ultimately helpful because it future-proofed the book. It made it much twistier, and I think it made it a much better, sort of more universal book.
Nice. The title of the new book is The Night Agent, and you kind of touched on that we are dealing in this book with some subject matter that could be ripped right from today's headlines. And I know before we started recording, we were talking about the writing process and how long it takes to bring something to market. So the story is a couple of years old from your mind. We were barely talking about some of those things when the story idea hatched for you. Tell us a little bit about the plot setup for this book and why it is so timely right now.
Well, the initial hook and the thing that got everyone excited about this book was the idea of a night agent or night watch officer, and that was based on a real life friend of mine who had a very cool similar job for the FBI. And I just knew him in D.C. when I was a reporter. He couldn't really talk about it back then, but he would just disappear every night. And everyone was like, "Oh, what's he do?" And
Right.
the impression I took away, which was based really on like whispers and nothing, was that he went to some secret op center and waited by a phone every night. And then when that phone rang, it meant things had hit the fan. And he was supposed to wake up the director or the president. And, that's not really his job, but that's the world he was in. His job ended up actually being cooler. I got to talk to him years later for the book. So that's the hook and the setup. And then I haven't talked about this is my first interview about the book. So I don't have my red lines about spoilers in my head yet, but it's the idea is that
tell it all, Matthew. It's just me and you, and I've read the book. So.
That there's a Russian mole inside the White House, and he's not sure who to trust. So that's a setup, and that when we started was not. It wasn't above the fold of the New York Times every day like it is now, and but it was fun. Terrifying, but also fun to react to that stuff and to think of ways that you could play off of what readers would know. And you do get to change the book up until much closer to publication and to keep readers guessing. So the news became another thing to riff off and use as a surprise in the same way that smart thriller readers have seen all the twists, so you can sort of play off of what people know to keep them guessing.
So I was a kid that grew up, I was born in the 70s, my teenage years were in the 80s. We, I don't know if you remember the old movie Red Dawn. With Patrick Swayze. So, that was kind of our mindset, that was always worried that the Russia or the Soviets were going to parachute in one day. And those fears were overblown, of course, but, that's kind of the specter that we lived under. And then one side of the political spectrum was, hawkish and, anti-Soviet. The other side of the political spectrum wanted to open dialogue and, think that there was a peaceful resolution. And, now in the world we live in, it's, a lot of things have kind of switched, and the other side is now kind of pro-Russia, and one side is hawkish that was not at one time. And it's such a weird place that we find ourselves in now, and kind of the same dark enemies, air quotes, but not the same at the same time. When you start researching a book like this and really trying to get down to the details that you could then develop twists and things like that, where do you begin dealing with a country like Russia and the political climate and all of that stuff?
Well, they murdered a guy down the street, allegedly, I should say, down the street from my apartment in D.C. at the DuPont Circle Hotel. It was an oligarch setting up the GRU. And BuzzFeed, which has an incredible investigative reporting team and pours tons of money into it.
Which is crazy to even say.
I know, but they
BuzzFeed.
have, my friend used to work for them, and they hired incredible people. And Jason Leopold, and he has other co-reporters on these stories, has been great on this. But yeah, there was I think 2015 murder there, and it was in the DuPont Circle Hotel, which I used to walk by, and I used to steal Wi-Fi from the Starbucks,
Right.
around the corner from it. So
As one does.
It's a real thing. And so just reading the newspaper, and what's funny is when I started writing thrillers, you had this sense that, yeah, they are a little over the top and larger than life, because people were talking about which indexing system to use for the inflation numbers, and then you would have something where politicians are murdering people and people are turning up and dead all over Washington, and you have nefarious foreign influence. But the news and politics have become completely crazy, and it's hard to even conceive of how past the norms we are. So it's a fascinating time to be a thriller writer, because it doesn't feel like over the top fantasy land. It feels
Right.
like you're much closer to what's happening.
Well, it seems like the world that we grew up in was more black and white, more monolithic. And today the world is very gray, and it seems like allegiances change day to day. And I would think for a thriller writer that this has got to be an amazing time to be writing, because literally anything is possible.
Yeah, and you don't have to do much research. You just do your best to keep up with the news, and one day you're learning about money laundering, and the next day you're learning about El Chapo's encrypted communication network, and then the next day I could go on and on. So yeah, there's just an amazing amount of stuff out there, and yeah, it's funny to go back to what you mentioned about people switching sides and there being strange bedfellows, because it's a funny moment. This book for me was in some ways a love letter to the great 70s conspiracy thrillers of kind of the post-Watergate era.
Yeah.
And then the FBI and the CIA are the bad guys, the deep state are the bad guys. But, you find yourself in a funny position now where, Democrats have these Robert Mueller posters, and he's, the squarest Republican you'll ever find in your life. So I think it's nice to be able to hearken back to those things we all love, but also to try to pay attention enough and be flexible enough with the genre tropes to breathe a little life into them.
Well, the book is not only about FBI agent Peter Sutherland and this the situation he finds himself in, and the mole in the White House, but tell us about Rose. And Rose is a young woman who calls Peter, and something has happened with her right in front of her, and this other storyline starts emerging there that you deftly weave together as the book goes on. Tell us about Rose and how this part of the story comes in.
Well, it's nice, in these books, which are different characters, people with different levels of experience, and it's always great to have different ways into the story and different characters that different people can relate to. And I had written a couple books with completely badass special operators, because I got to meet some here in San Diego. They're all over the place. And so going back to the Everyman book, it was nice to go back to characters that were more relatable. So Rose has kind of a family connection that she's not really aware of to the national security world, and finds herself, plunged into the middle of this this affair. And but she's incredibly resourceful and in many ways saves the day. And also it's fun to have two characters and to see them, get closer over the course of a book. That's something I picked up, in terms of writing tips and things like that. I was talking to somebody and he was like, when you pick up a book, you want a great plot, but really you want to see people connecting. And I thought that was such a great point. And as I look back, a lot of my favorite things in the book were like that. So I wanted to have these two young people you could root for, and then also it's really an enjoyable writing exercise to have them to have obstacles and to not trust each other, and to have a lot of back and forth with that, and to have people torn between very noble impulses. So that Rose as a character I love, and it was really enjoyable to plot out their arc.
Well, we talk a lot about the fact that that plot lines and genre, things that define a genre and tropes, those things are all wonderful and we love them and they make for exciting books. But they're kind of window dressing on the story that we're really telling. The stories that we're really telling are stories about the human condition and people in conflict with one another and people in relationship with one another. And, you can tell the same kind of story as a horror, as a science fiction story, as a fantasy story, or as a political thriller. If you allow yourself to really get down to the core of what the story is and how these people are interacting with one another.
Oh yeah. I mean, one big thing I've learned over the years is that, genre tropes and the structure of these books is something it really behooves an author to know. It doesn't mean you have to, recycle something or be cliche. But I found, that a lot of the things that you pick up are over hard-won experience. You see other books and movies having those similar. It's not exactly like scenes, but it's these crucial things, like, your protagonist having to face off against his worst fear, or, being brought down and trying to think of, a fate that's worse than death, and, a really the most difficult possible moment you could imagine before the resolution. And so I do value a lot of that genre stuff. And one funny thing, when I was doing the Peter and Rose stuff, I actually looked up the buddy comedy, romantic comedy genre tropes, and they're fantastic. And the romantic comedy is super strict in terms of genre, but it also works for great buddy comedies. But, you look at those and, you can abstract from that and think about all of your favorite things in storytelling. And, that was helpful as I was thinking about how do you show two people, coming together in all of the ups and downs of that.
Well, I have a wife and 3 daughters, and there are a lot of romantic comedies and things like that, going on in our house all of the time. And there's some fantastic things that you can learn, from all genres. And that's one reason I like to have authors from the whole spectrum on, because we can all learn from each other and pick up tips and tricks that it's been defined in one genre, and when we bring those things over into our genre, I think it makes for deeper, richer storytelling.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's just I'm a huge story geek. So when somebody says, well, a movie like Lethal Weapon is just a rom-com with 2 guys,
right?
It's an action comedy. It's all the same moves.
Yeah.
And then you start to go like, oh my God. And then when somebody says, well, an art house movie has a good guy and a bad guy, but the bad guy is a lack of self-knowledge. And the first time somebody pointed out that to me, and that it's plotted the same as a shoot 'em up thriller, I just had to sit down and stare at the wall for 5 minutes. I thought that was so cool.
I love it. Matthew, are you a deep plotter ahead of time before writing? How much pre-writing goes into your novels?
I do a lot. I like to lay in the plumbing carefully for all the twists. And the thrillers are plotted, and they're so tricky that I found when I seat of the pants it, you have to rewrite the book 3 or 4 times, and sometimes you find yourself in an intractable situation. So I figure out, my hook and my big twists, and have a sense of the ending, and then dive in. And then when I write super duper fast. What feels to me super duper fast, like you were saying with Stephen King, and 3 or 4 months. And I just get the roughest possible draft down. But I sort of know that the story is going to work. And that way, the inspiration can come. And I can tear up huge swaths of it after rereading and reacting to it like a reader. And I'm not tearing up prose that I've labored over for hours. I have a very rough draft. Because you do leave a lot of room open for inspiration and twists. And, at the end of the book, you're like, oh my God, that guy could be that guy the whole time. And then you read the whole book and you're like, yes, they, that doesn't defy the laws of physics. I can get away with that.
Right.
And then you'll do that. So that's how I've been working.
Well, that's really where the magic happens, is in the editing. What's the saying? Writing is rewriting.
Yeah.
But until you get that kind of dirty first draft out, you are kind of laboring over the story, but having that skeleton finished, it seems like the writing just becomes fluid, after that point. There's something about, editing and filling in a story that's so much easier than trying to dream it up as you go.
It's such a psychological game.
It is.
I mean, I've been doing this for a while. I usually am ahead of deadline. And when I get near the end of the book, I get crazy headaches, and it's super stressful. And so just having a story that's done, even if it's, the roughest thing in the world, is such a relief. And then you can read it and see what to fix. And, my analogy, because I grew up, my dad had us doing kind of endless renovations, and the kids by his side is, when you frame out a house, then you put in the sheetrock, then you do the paint and finish and put in the molding and that sort of thing. And the idea of writing a book, and I know people are totally different on this, but the idea of writing a book where the prose is perfect, from beginning to end, and you've labored over every sentence, it's like the idea of building a house from left to right for me, doing the paint and finish as you go.
Right. Do you hold your writing process or your writing environment precious? Do you need to be in the same place with the same inspirational music or coffee or things like that or are you the guy that can just take your laptop wherever and just pop it open and write?
I do like to be like in a quiet place. I have, a spot in my house where I have a nice spot for my laptop and then an office. So I find those to be very helpful. And I've read a lot of stuff that, having sort of a ritual space is very helpful. And it just means, when you sit down, you mean business. I think the most important thing is an ability to turn off the internet there.
Yeah.
And I'm just shocked because I'm a grown, relatively, accomplished guy who thinks he's in command of his brain. But if I sit down at a computer to do some very important task to my life and well-being, I will end up dicking around on the internet.
Yeah.
And I have to physically unplug a cable and then I can write. And I found that to be kind of the most important ritual move of the past couple of years.
In the South, we would say, "I'm a grown-ass man. Why can't I just step away from the internet?"
No.
It's crazy. I know that's a very real struggle, and I feel like that's a very 21st century struggle. I don't know that the folks that went before us had that sort of distraction struggle, but
I think they drank, right?
Well, yeah. So and sometimes committed suicide and crazy stuff. So hopefully we're moving past some of that.
That's a real productivity drain.
That's a real product. Yeah, your output will be next to nothing after that. We shouldn't make light, but it's it's a real thing. Do you are you a software geek at all? Do you what do you write in, and do you find that there are any productivity tools or maybe software packages that help your writing process, or are you just kind of a linear writer, open up Word and go at it?
I am a huge like software geek to the point where one of the ways I procrastinate is with these like time-saving life hack kind of things.
I am the same way.
But I used to try to plot the books out the way you would solve, a mathematical proof or something, as though it weren't just some magic black box. And I ran into a lot of trouble with that. But I have things now that actually do save my life every day. One is Scrivener, the word processing, kind of long book project writing. And, there are moments frequently where I just stop and express my love and gratitude for Scrivener. Because it's so time saving, and you can keep all your comments in your rough draft and still spit out a cleaned up copy, and you can look at all the scenes that involve the same MacGuffin, and I just think it's incredible. So Scrivener is really my favorite. And then the other thing I love is I've used a bunch, but different voice memo things. And if you can have something where it just keeps track of the idea and actually transcribes it, that's phenomenal. So I've been using one called Otter voice transcription or something like that. And that's great because you just talking to it, and it's like Dragon Naturally Speaking on your phone, and then all your notes end up typed up in the cloud, and you can just look at them, and 90% of what you think of is terrible, but it's great to look through it all and find that 1%. And I use Evernote for a lot of my book ideas too.
Nice. Matthew, the new book out today, The Night Agent. This is a phenomenal book. I love it. I will probably reread it again, pretty soon. I love the book. But this is your fifth, novel. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. As a kind of a wrap up question, how do you feel like you have grown or changed as an author, as a thriller writer, maybe specifically, after having 5 of these under your belt? Do you feel like the process gets easier? Is it easier to jump into a project at the beginning, or is it kind of still the same struggle with each book?
Well, there are landmines in every book, I think, but I think it's definitely gotten easier. I think the big learning over the course of all the books is to to not show off, and to sort of stay out of my own way and let the story tell itself.
Which is one of those things you learn in journalism.
Yeah, I think so. And also something that somebody could have told me when I was 28 and writing the first book I got published, 28, 29, and I would have been, I wouldn't have listened because I hadn't had incredibly painful lessons. But yeah, I find myself every time just, working toward a simpler story, and getting out of the way and not trying to constantly blow people's minds with a plot twist or some cool flourish or something like that.
Excellent. Well, Matthew, is there a place where if people are just discovering you and want to know more about you and your work, is there a place online where they could connect with you, dig into your back catalog, and find out more about what you do?
Yeah, I have a website. It's not the most. It's not. It's a relatively simple website, MatthewQuirk.com, but that has all my books and kind of news and events, and also I put stuff on Facebook and Twitter. I have an author page on Facebook, and I'm MQUIRK at Twitter. So all of those places.
Excellent. I'll link it all up in the show notes. Matthew, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. I'm a huge fan of what you're doing, and we're going to send everybody to pick up their copy of The Night Agent.
Oh, thanks for having me, and thanks for I really, really appreciate you reading the book, and I'm so glad you liked it.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Hedwig slipped into David's den, the circular reading room. A ladder of crude rungs protruded from the wall, remnant of its days as a grain silo. He pulled himself upward, rung by rung, until the bookcases and sofas were far below. Even if he fell and died, he didn't really care anymore. No, he did care. He couldn't die yet. She had to die first. That would make their divorce final if she wanted it so much. Darkness enveloped him. He reached the top of the ladder and stepped off onto a catwalk of black mesh, lit only by the faint light of the 4 square windows that encircled the turret. From this perch he could see the exit she would use. He felt like an assassin, like Lee Harvey Oswald in the window of the Texas schoolbook depository. But he wouldn't use a rifle. No, rifles leave evidence. Rifles can be produced in court. Rifles can miss. He pulled back a shroud of burlap and opened the cardboard box he'd stashed up here earlier that day. He reached into it and withdrew the only murder weapon, the only magic bullet a Van Brunt could ever need. The gold lantern flashed in the moonlight. He held it up to the window. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, he thought. And then it's time for a midnight ride. But it won't be Paul Revere. No, not Paul Revere at all. He found the oyster knife at last. He lay his cupped palm sideways over the vent. Don't get blood on your Armani. And stabbed the blade into his palm. The blood came hot. He dripped it into the lantern, where the skull of the horseman waited to sip it like nectar. The reliquary glowed, and an incantation in Old Dutch appeared, shining from within the metal. It was time. Hedwig bent and whispered into the vents. Rise headless and ride. The letters vanished, and a cold white light burst from the thing. The skull wasn't just a skull anymore. It had gestated. Capillaries clung to it the way fine hair clings to the crown of a newborn. A thick, carotid artery moved with snake-like undulation, drinking blood from the pool at the base, pulling it upwards to circulate through scarlet vessels, through twisting coils, slurping the liquid greedily, the way little Zeph used to slurp strawberry Nesquik through a crazy straw. The blood pulsed and pushed into the nose, into the eyes, into the hollow cavity within the skull. But was it hollow still? Hedwig didn't think so. He felt a mind growing there, something with a will to challenge his own. He fixed his gaze to the twin caverns of its eye sockets, speaking slowly and deliberately. Jessica Bridge. The death's head grin broadened somehow, and a thread of black and green liquid, shiny as a horsefly's wings, trickled from the gap of a missing eye tooth. Only Jessica Bridge. Do you understand? He shook the lantern. Do you understand? The face lurched forward and struck the glass, leaving a red splash there. It wobbled and settled, smiling and nodding. Jessica Bridge, hissed the face. Yes. Hedwig raised the lantern a little. Jessica Bridge. The red face tipped backwards and the jaw cracked wide. Hedwig recoiled. Something pink and wet writhed inside that mouth. The nub of a new tongue, salivating as if it could taste the name. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge.